there, welcome back to Just the Sip, Tongasmic Wine Exploration and Adventure with me, your hostess Norma. And today I have Dr. Dana Di Pietro. Did I get it right?
You did. Perfect.
Jeez.
Excellent pronunciation.
Wow, thank you. And you had better sit down, charge your vessel, because we are going to have an amazing show. Dana is going to talk about ancient history of wine. Where did wine come from? How is it that we're enjoying this 6,000 or so years later? I'm jumping ahead. So stick with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Norma Normington. Got Dr. Dana with me. Dana says, just call him Dana.
That's Dana. Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Absolutely.
So, Dana, tell me your wine story. What day did you wake up, or like, not wake up, but like you're experiencing wine and you're like, I love wine.
That's like one of those things you're like, oh, from the day I was born. You're like, maybe not.
No,
maybe
like
when you were...
in your baby bottle.
Yeah.
No.
Well, my mom was actually a wine exporter.
And she was going to say she puts them in your baby bottle. Okay, no.
Well, actually, she was pretty good about that. I did sneak sips at tastings. She was a wine exporter in the 1980s.
Wow.
So she was working with Konaktai and a couple of Zinfandel exporters, and was known as Frau Zinfandel in Germany, where she would export her wine to Ramstein Air Base. So I kind of was tied in at that early age.
So you knew kind of what wine was growing up.
Yeah, and certainly, as I got older, I wouldn't say my appreciation changed, but my interest definitely went up in college. But really got tied into it from an archaeological perspective when I was working on a related topic, ancient beer. So we were doing a lot of research on beer in the ancient world, and ancient Egyptian beer particularly. And I got involved in a project when I was studying abroad at the American University in Cairo, doing ancient beer recipes. We were trying to bring back these recipes from people like Zosimos of Panopolis and make them in the modern day. And they were pretty good. We actually ended up, kind of corking them off, but they're actively fermenting, so they exploded in our dorm room. So the love affair kind of went this way and that way.
So you were in love with beer first.
Yes.
And then you were like, wait a minute, there's ancient wine.
Yeah, I came back to the topic because I came across some really interesting articles that were talking about wine in ancient Egypt. And we can get into that a little bit.
So just one day you were like, man, I really like wine.
Yeah, and I also had this opportunity to start working at a wine shop.
Oh.
So I needed something while I was writing my dissertation to do something totally different.
Decompress.
I got an opportunity to work at Vintage Berkeley.
Discounts.
Yeah. Well, there's a 40% discount. Yeah, that also probably sealed the deal.
Yeah. Okay, we'll pay you minimum wage, but 40% discount.
Exactly.
Count me in.
And actually, a lot of the friends that I made at the shop ended up being, they're still some of my best friends in the world. And we do this club together. So that's part of
That's how the ancient wine guys came together.
That's right. So the kind of combination of interests, friends from academia working on similar topics, friends in the wine world, and then, the two just sort of naturally came together. So.
Meshed. Yeah, beautifully. That's a great story. Yeah. I didn't have any ancient wine brewing experiences or beer brewing. That's hilarious. I love that.
I think the great thing is people think, ancient wine, how old is it? Like you're drinking the actual wine from, the late Bronze Age, and you're like, okay, no, it's a new wine.
Yeah, we're going to get into that.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah, so tell me about how we discovered how far wine goes back. Well, what's the first evidence of humans drinking wine or making wine? We assume they drink it.
Yeah, and there's some debate about this, and it's actually a really interesting question because we have to start thinking about, okay, well, when we're talking about wine, what are we talking about? And in this case, we're talking about grapes. We're talking about, just our standard wine grapes, our Vitis vinifera that, is the basis for all the wine that we drink and enjoy today. The question of when people started really enjoying and drinking wine is one that can kind of be traced all the way back to that early process of domestication. So Vitis.
And when's that?
So that's around 12,000 years ago.
Okay.
And it comes alongside this
12,000 years ago.
12,000 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like 10,000 BC.
Wow.
That's right.
So we started, as soon as we started domesticating, we decided wine should be included in this.
Yeah, it was
That's
something
awesome.
that happened pretty quick, right? Because people were starting for the first time to grow their own agriculture. This is in the time, generally at the end of like the Neolithic Revolution is what we call it. Instead of hunting and gathering and moving around, using foraging for resources, all of a sudden we're planting, domesticating things like, dogs and cats. And there's this domestication that takes place of the grapevine. Okay. And the wild vine is called Vitis vinifera sylvestris. And it's a really different creature. Like you wouldn't even recognize it if you saw it in the wild. It's a vine, as we know, wines are vines. But it makes its way up to the tops of trees, and the berries are small, they're bitter, the clumping is not the same. Essentially, over generations, over millennia, these vines were trained and bred for the characteristics we really enjoy today. Okay. Things like big grapes, things like lots of sugar. So, the sugar can be broken down and with xymase made into alcohol, the sturdiness of the skins, those sorts of things.
So I'm thinking, when you say we helped create nature here and took some of these stronger ones and grew those, like the grapes that had the properties we wanted, we kept improving upon them?
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So the wine story is very much tied to our human story. And what we find actually is that as settlement patterns, as Neolithic peoples moved throughout Eurasia up into the European continent, eastwards into Asia, the wine and the grapes followed them. So there was a study done about 2 years ago that actually traced back all the genetic origins of when this domestication event took place. And it's about 11,000 years ago.
Wow. It was interesting because I went to Sonoma the other day, and the introduction of vines here was from the Spanish missionaries, right? Yeah. And I'm thinking, hey, everybody, we're packing up for a trip. It's only going to be like 12 months long. Take only everything you need. And they're out there getting clippings, right? Yeah. And they're like, we better bring these.
Completely.
But, okay, I digress. Okay. So that is so interesting. And we know where this all started, right? Well,
there are two lines of evidence. So one is through this really amazing genetic study that was done. They took the entire genetic profiles of like 2,500 different varietals and were able to look at the genomes and literally trace back where they came from. So two places happened probably simultaneously. In the Caucasus, up, in and around Armenia and Turkey, and then also in Georgia, and then also down in the Levant. So we're talking modern Israel, Jordan, Palestine, in that part of the world. So it's interesting. The best archaeological evidence we have comes to us from Georgia, and that's about 8,000 years ago. And we can tell the difference actually archaeologically between these grapes, because with all those adaptations we were talking about, the grape pips, the seeds actually change. So the Vitis vinifera sylvestris, so Vitis vinifera sylvestris.
Can we just call them Sylvester?
Sylvester, yeah. Sylvestris is the wild one. It's actually got this sort of like rounded seed, and then vinifera vinifera has this like little point on it. And that's how you can tell the difference archaeologically. Wow. And so then you can date that because it's carbon, and we can get these dates. And so we can start talking about when these things happened and where they happened. And there's a lot of debate. There's so many countries that want to be the first, right?
Right, yes.
So big debates between Armenia and Georgia, even China as well.
But that doesn't matter. What matters is we have wine. So how did, they didn't have glass bottles back then, right? I'm assuming. Right. And the preservation and everything. So let's talk a little bit about how they made it, what they put it in, how they preserved it. Did they preserve it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So with wine growing in these regions, there's this sort of interest that takes place, right? Around, especially like around the Bronze Age. And to transport wine, you start seeing these amphora. You think about like ancient vessels, right? And you think about
like pottery.
Okay. Right? And a lot of times they have pointed, they come down to a point. That's actually because if you have a flat bottom on a jar, like a coffee cup, and you're transporting that, it's actually very easy to break. So wine, we end up seeing it traded actually as early as like, let's say, the early dynastic period in Egypt. So wine is being made, as I mentioned, in these two different regions around 3200 BC. Okay. Right? So we're talking like 5,200 years ago. King Scorpion, and he's a real guy. If you remember the Rock movie, totally legit. It's a completely accurate. No, it's not. The movie is totally wrong. But there was a King Scorpion in the pre-dynastic period. And in his tomb at Tomb UJ in Abydos, there were 700 wine jars that contained collectively about 4,500 liters of wine. So huge amounts of wine that were transported in these jars that were coming all the way from the Levant. So hundreds of miles all the way down to basically, right, Egypt. So the interest in wine, the connoisseurship, and it gets even more interesting. We can get into that later. Different types of wines.
So they had whatever containers. They figured out I'm going to call it pottery because I'm simple. How did they cap it? They weren't using corks back then.
Really good question, and that's actually a big point, and it's a checkbox in the evidence that what we're talking about is wine.
Okay.
So let's say, like in Iran, there's a site called Haji Firuz Tepe, and around 5600 BCE, they found, like Tomb UJ, right, these wine jars, and they were actually capped with clay. And inside, you actually have chemical residues. You have like tartaric acid, you have the wine pips. And this in and of itself, right, shows that at least grape juice is being had. I think conservative folks might, ask the question like, archaeologically conservative. Like, well, how do you know it's wine? How do you know it's wine? There's no evidence that it's alcohol. Maybe it's just grape juice. Maybe they're having Well,
but the pips in there.
But the clay, to your point, right, they're sealing it. They're actually covering the top. They're letting it ferment. And we see that continue on through Egypt, through Mesopotamia. By the time of Egypt's 18th dynasty, which is, during the late Bronze Age, so we're talking about like 1200 BCE, believe it or not, they're actually even labeling the wines. So you can have, at multiple sites, we find these broken vessels, and in hieratic, the sort of cursive way of writing ancient Egyptian, it includes the year of the wine, the vinter's name, the vineyard it came from, the quality of the wine, and a couple notes. So it would be like a year 4 wine.
Like tasting notes.
Yeah. There's a Robert Parker score. It was only three points. The ancient Egyptian triliteral sign for good is Nefer, N-F-R. You might think of like Ankh, right? A-N-K-H, right? Ankh is it looks almost like that. It's upside down, but it means good. And you could have Nefer wines, you could have Nefer wines, or Nefer wines.
And, I was waiting for it.
Yeah. So we find these actually in places, even in the tomb of Tutankhamun, right? There are wine jars with these labels, with the clay stoppers on top to preserve them. Probably not for, the afterlife, but, not
in depth.
Exactly. Evidence of white wine actually even enjoyed in the time of Tutankhamun. But next to these different types, right, you'll see a year 4 wine or a year 2 wine of different qualities. So wine cellars, connoisseurship, all these things. Yeah.
Wow. Now, okay, I was going to ask about fermentation, but it sounds like it's happening in the container.
Correct.
So they're going to put everything in there, cap it, and the fermentation, when you uncap it, it's good to go.
Well, let me actually step back on that. So probably a variety of different approaches. And we see this all the way like into the Roman period of some fermentation taking place, right, in ceramic vessels.
Okay.
Early on, right, fermentation's taking place largely in underground vats. So in Armenia, there's a site called Arini 1, and that dates to about 6,400 years ago. That's our earliest evidence, not just of wine and winemaking, but of, it's the first winery that's ever been found. It's right on the Iranian border. And it's this site where there's a giant, well, not giant, it's like 3 feet by 3 feet. It's a pressing platform where they would bring the grapes in, stomp them. And you can see the channel that goes to one of these big underground vats. And the wine would ferment there.
Okay.
And that's similar to the fermentation practices that are happening in Georgia even today.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Not far from how it's produced today.
Correct. Yeah. And in some of these places, those traditions, like the traditions in Georgia, have been going for 6,000 years.
Wow. And for those of you who didn't notice, Jinxie has joined this conversation.
We're talking about Egypt. That's why.
So you can't have a discussion without cats. Perfect timing, Jinxie. So did kings and queens have different levels of wine than the commoners? And did I only get one never and you get two? Like, then we're talking commerce.
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. Certainly in, the context that we find these things, a lot of times archaeologically we're finding things in tombs, which are, can be like Tutankhamun's tomb, for example, right? The elite. A lot of the evidence that we have for the values of wine and the trade of wine, some of the earliest comes from this site called Ugarit, which is kind of contemporary. We're talking about Egypt's 18th dynasty. This is a period in the Mediterranean where there are all these amazing interactions happening for the first time. You've got the Hittites in like Turkey, fighting and trading with the Egyptians to the south on the other side. You've got Mesopotamia and the Assyrian Empire starting up to the far east. You've got Mycenaean Greece, right? This is the Greece that Homer's writing about, right? Yeah. Agamemnon and Cyprus, which is doing all kinds of crazy stuff too. They're all trading and talking to each other, all kinds of stuff. So right in the middle of that is a city called Ugarit. Okay. And Ugarit has this sort of like intermediate, it's like Switzerland. It's like, hey, we're just trading. We just want to make a lot of money. And it's to everybody's advantage. It's pretty autonomous. Does a lot of work with Cyprus. And what we have from Ugarit are records of documents, all of the sales. Wow. And that's actually kind of why writing emerged in the first place, was to keep track of stuff. Right? There were receipts. Earliest writing we have in the form of boule and stuff around 3200 is from receipts, people trading stuff and keeping track of it. Things like interest even start up at that point pretty quick. Yeah. We go pretty dark with the capitalism pretty early on, but I digress. So what we see in these receipts is the trading of certain kinds of wine. And so you'll see like different names of wine, and there'll be a quality wine, like low quality of wine. And then we see the price of what it's being sold for. So there are these commodity, like they're set amounts for silver, right? So like the silver shekel, right? And let's just call it a shekel for the sake of argument.
Thank you.
0.3 shekels for a jar of this kind of wine. So you have a set price, and you can then look and say, well, what did that buy? Oh, it would buy you like half of a sheep. We also then see, right, in other tablets, the trading of wine like Kepsalem wines, which are so unique and so expensive and so crazy. They're like 4 shekels, wow, which is like 3 bowls. You could buy a house with it.
Wow.
So the same sense of, right, value. This isn't just something that is a commodity, right? It's not just something that you're enjoying that's fulfilling, checking a box. There's connoisseurship. There's, speculation. There's trade. And so having these wines definitely becomes part of the privilege and the culture, and it's political. Egypt doesn't grow its own wine. Egypt has to essentially attack Canaan, kidnap their winemakers. Kamosa actually says, I took the Canaanites and I made them press their grapes for me. And he brings them to the south in Egypt. And when we see those names on the wine labels, sometimes they're actually Canaanite names, which is nuts. It's like if the United States was like, hey, we want to start our wine business. Let's attack France and kidnap a bunch of French winemakers. And then it's like, oh, my name is Henri. I'm here in Napa, but I'm making good wine at least. So
I'm glad we didn't have to get to that. I'm glad we have environments that will support our wine industry as well. We didn't have to do anything so drastic like that to our French that we love so. So I'm so glad you were talking about, I'll say, like ancient Greece, because now we see that really into mythology and religion.
Yeah.
So when did we first, and I try to stay pretty apolitical in this show, but we can't talk about wine without talking about religion.
Absolutely. So, especially in ancient world.
Oh yeah. So let's how was it used all over the place? But let's say initially, and then kind of transcending through the decades.
Yeah. Totally.
Centuries, I should say.
And I should also say a caveat about this. Anytime that archaeologically, I'm a big spoiler alert, everybody here. Every time you hear archaeologists talking about ritual object or ritual this, it's often code for, we don't understand what the hell that's happening with that thing or what's going on. We know, but it's kind of hard to disentangle some of these institutions, right? So very early on, when we think about wine. What does it take to make wine? You have to have access to materials. You have to have access to time. You have to have access to labor. So oftentimes, right, this is why it ends up in the elite sphere. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you're going to make because the calories are going to be advantageous to you, right? You're not finding legumes and cooking them for the first time and unlocking all these calories, right? This is a luxury item. Yeah. And for that reason, right, it kind of inhabits that elite sphere. And so similarly, just like we're talking about politics in wine, religion and wine often are tied together. I think that when you see in the ancient world specific knowledge that is a technology that's tied to transformation, oftentimes there's a religious kind of connotation. So in Cyprus, they were famous for like casting bronze. They mixed tin or arsenic with copper and they made bronze and shipped it all over the Mediterranean. Okay. There were temples that were kind of associated with that process. And it was religious, but also it was economical. Like it had the whole thing was kind of tied together. And similarly with wine, right? We see wine inhabiting this space of having like those capsulum wines I was mentioning. Mm-hmm. Those were destined for a temple. They were going to be used in rituals. Okay. But also probably enjoyed. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man, this is fascinating, truly. Gosh, where am I going next with this? I don't know. Let's talk about this wine. Yeah. That's a good thing to talk about.
Totally. Good segue.
Yeah. Fabulous segue. So tell me about Ancient Wine Guys, because you talked about working with the shop and how it came together and how you decided to bring together your wine club. I think this is also just as fascinating.
Oh, no, thanks. Yeah. It's been a really fun and rewarding experience. And I have to mention my partners who I actually talked about a little bit. Ryan O'Hara, Tino, and Jeff Pearson. Jeff and I were actually graduate students together at UC Berkeley and kind of came up the ranks together and were tied in and interested in these topics. And then we met T and Ryan from working at the wine shop. So all together, we were actually, this started as a fundraiser for some nonprofit work that we do. And quickly we're like, we could probably, we're taking all this effort to find these wines and these varietals and styles that, distributors are all too happy to actually turn us onto, because they're very difficult to like sell on the market, right? You're gonna have a hard time at Safeway, peddling something like this.
I just don't think people know.
Yeah, it's
right. It's awareness pieces like what? There's ancient varietals still in circulation that we're drinking right now. What?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's finding that space and having that ability to have a conversation. And so in that sense, we're kind of doing the teaching we used to do, and also, right, the drinking that we love to do, and bringing it all together and having these great conversations. So we started the club probably about 2 years ago. It's 4 bottles every quarter, and we do these write-ups. And every club has a theme. So we'll do, the wines of Diocletian, who has a palace, this beautiful palace in Split in Croatia. And we just focus on Croatian wines, but also talk about the connections there. And we'll do wines of volcanoes, right? We'll do a topical club where we talk about volcanoes and take wines from Etna and even California. We got our first Californian wine from up in Lake County. So, just different ways of exploring these questions and interconnections and fostering a community. We have about like 70 members now. And we do events, we do online tastings, in-person events, and we actually even took our first group on a trip. So we've broached into taking folks out. Travel. This was our trip in Greece we just did this last summer. So, yeah.
And, okay, so you tickled my brain. So let's talk about mythology, because we can't drink wine without talking about our favorite 2 Roman and Greek gods, right? Yeah. You got Dionysus and Bacchus.
Correct. Yeah.
So let's talk about those guys for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of back to this question that I
back on track.
The sense of, right, this ambiguity between religion and the role that wine's playing. Right? Let's not say ambiguity, that wine plays so many different roles in society, right? Economic, political, and spiritual and religious. Dionysus is a really interesting character. When we think about Dionysus, who's also known as Bacchus, right? He's adopted whole cloth by the Romans. but he's also Bacchus is unlike where it was like Zeus and Jupiter or Venus or Aphrodite, right? Bacchus is like is Dionysus and Bacchus in both Greece, and same guy.
Yeah.
He embodies this really fascinating duality, right? With mythology, I used to teach with a professor at UC Berkeley named Anthony Bullock. We taught Greek mythology together. I was his TA, and he was incredibly fond of saying, "If these are my myths, who am I?" That's how he would sort of posit it with the to the class, and the whole idea was
you had to guess. Guess what you got?
I think the eyes kind of glazed over. And he was wonderful. He's English, right? So, but he would explain mythology as a language, almost like a algebraic formula for asking questions of what if, right?
Okay.
So like, so men are coming home from battle and they've been away for 10 years, right? The Trojan War.
Sure.
What does it look like when they get back? Solve for X. And you have like the story of Menelaus, whose wife is faithful to him and he's a good person. You have Agamemnon, who killed his own daughter, right? And what happens there? You have Odysseus, who's somewhere in between and ends up with a situation that's somewhere in between, right? So Greek myth is asking these questions. And Dionysus, as a god of wine, is really doing the same thing. He's exploring like the duality and these concepts that seem at first to be really in contrast with each other. He's a god of fertility. He's a god of civilization. We think about all the things that you need to grow wine. But at the other hand, right, you go too far. And he's a god of chaos. He's a god of anger and brutality. And so just like wine, right, he embodies that sort of space.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because when I think of that, this is horrible, but you think of like college fraternities and stuff, right?
Sure.
And that's not it at all. Dionysus was like a little bit deeper.
I think that Dionysus probably smiles down on the fraternities and their like revels and was like, "Yeah, that's good. You do you. That's fine." It's probably with Natty Light, but that's okay.
I think that's pretty much what that Greek/Roman god is remembered as, though, for commoners like me, right? For the wine and drinking properties and just enjoying the better things of life and imbibing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He has a really interesting role also. I mean, think about like wine is often associated with these gods that are tied with agriculture and oftentimes like death and rebirth. So Osiris was, tied in with Egyptian wine. Mm-hmm. It was his realm and he was killed and resurrected. Dionysus, similarly, right, was actually killed as a baby and brought back. And he inhabits all these dual roles. He's actually like born of Semele, who's immortal. He's not a full god. Well, he is a full god, but he's not like Heracles, who also is like, has one god as a parent, one human as a parent. Right. So he kind of somehow skips the gate and he's like a true, real god. Okay. But he dies and comes back, right? And is resurrected. Jesus, right? Drink this glass of me, right? And remember me. Drink this glass of me. Actually, that's theologically correct, right? Because it's the blood of Christ.
It is true.
So, so you see these patterns kind of continuing, and there's good reason for it as well. So that mythology is really intertwined very deeply. So
wow. Yeah. Okay, back into how do you know what's an ancient variety?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I'm not looking at the labels and going, "Oh, that one's ancient." Because here's the other thing I learned. Vines that are over 40 years old now in current modern like winemaking is considered ancient. But that's not what we're talking about.
Correct. Yeah. And in fact,
ancient wines.
Well, this is this is the thing about wines in history, right? Is that in their DNA, like in that study I was telling you, they actually chart where they came from and how they got here, right? We can trace Zinfandel's story all the way back, back to Croatia, right? So I would say that like
upward.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. Excuse me, everybody. Yeah. Probably just flashed everyone when I did that. Sorry.
So I think we kind of talk about things in terms of I don't think there are any varietals that exist today that are truly ancient.
Okay.
There are varietals that we believe have remained fairly unchanged since antiquity. Some types of grapes that are even mentioned by like Herodotus or some of the Greek and Roman authors.
So how long ago was that?
you're looking at like Herodotus is like 8th century BC, 7th century, 700 BC, 800 BC rather. So in those locations, but then we'll do genetic tests, right? And like someone will say like, hey, I'm growing a couscous in Turkey. And then they check it and it's not a couscous. It's like something else, right? So there's the cultural component to it. There's the historical component. And then sometimes science is like changing the picture of how we look at this. We used to think that all the wines that went everywhere came from the Caucasus. But now, right, this last study really shows that the domestication event that took place in the ancient Near East, in the Levant, that is actually the probable origin for most of the wines. So it's sort of unseeded. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get hate mail through your website, but it's kind of unseeded Armenia and Georgia a little bit, right? Taking a little bit of the glory away from them.
Well, who's to know? Right? Who's to know? So I think the easy answer is, if we want to try some of these ancient wine, which we're drinking right now, Dr. Dana brought over this wonderful bottle, and I showed the label, but I'll show it again, just so you can talk about it.
Oh, yeah.
And the front and the back. You want me?
Oh, sure. No. Yeah, totally. So I can say a couple words about it if you want.
Yeah.
So since we're talking about ancient wines today, I thought it would be appropriate to bring over a bottle of wine from our friends at Pheasant's Tears. This is an operation in Kakheti, in the Kakheti region of Georgia, which is far to the east in Georgia. And one of the traditional winemaking, areas when we're talking about 6,000, 7,000 years of history. So the winery is run by John Verdeman, who was kind enough to actually let us stay with him for a couple of days. And he showed us around. He took us around the winery, and wine there, and this wine that we're trying, is made in the traditional Qvevri fermenting style. So what happens with this wine?
And that is the underground vat, is that
exactly
what you were talking about earlier?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, just like we were talking about, like at Arini one.
Wow.
These wines are fermented in these giant, and they're actually huge. They're these giant underground vats. People have to actually climb down inside them to clean them.
That sounds so insane.
We had a chance to see that. And they're only cleaned with natural things like vinegar and beeswax. You can't, so cleanliness is key. And the opportunity, because no sulfates, no
additives.
No additives. And that's not to say I'm not preaching about natural wines here. There are very good reasons for putting sulfates and other things in wine, fining wine. But this tradition is really trying to preserve what is a UNESCO intangible heritage. It's on the list, right? So all these grapes, in this case, John maintains a vine library.
Oh, I'll show you the back label because that's pretty impressive. And that's all the varietals you said that are in there.
Exactly. So he's got 120 different varietals that he's experimenting with, mixing, that are all native and autochthonous to Georgia. And these are varietals that have been used, again, for millennia. And every year, Pheasant's Tears puts out this polyphonia, and it's a blend of all of those varietals. So you have a little bit of every single varietal going back 6,000 years in your glass.
Wow.
And it's always just fantastic because the effort that's put into this wine, it's a huge amount of labor to do this style of winemaking, to do it correctly and not have it blow up in your face, right?
Yeah.
And we're just huge fans. So. And
this is 13%, which is not horrible. I mean, it's actually a little bit lower than we're used to for California wines.
Yeah.
So
it's
not low alcohol, but a little bit lower. So I'm in my neighborhood liquor store, and I'm like, where's my ancient varieties? Not gonna find them, pretty much, right? But can we? I mean, let's educate people on how they can find, in addition to your wine club.
Yeah.
How can they find them? They should, do they ask?
It's kind of they're different orders of operation, right? I think if you're dealing with, say, like a big, you have the wine section of a big supermarket.
Sure.
You're doing a chain. You're looking for a broad level, and all of these things are just, this is not a judgment call on anything, right? there are spaces just like an ecosystem where there are big whales and then small sharks and little, things doing this and that, right? That are very specified. And the smaller you get, the creepier and weirder they get. That's kind of what our club is. We're the weird, creepy little crustacean.
This is other reds.
Yeah, it's like we do the very specific.
Like the one with the light bulb on its head.
Yeah.
It's got like the super teeth.
So we're really deep down, right? You want to go deep? We're down at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, waiting for you with our little white like light bulb. Come closer. Come try the Mitzvani. Come and try some varietals you've never heard of.
Yeah, right.
This stuff is made in China. Yeah,
but we really can't find it anywhere else. Is my point.
It's possible. They're definitely.
Because they're independent wine shops.
Yeah.
That if the proprietor knows enough, can actually either special order or may actually have one on the shelf.
It tends to be so weird that the context of it, like I'll give a good example. When we worked at the wine shop at Vintage Berkeley, we obtained this amazing Pais. And Pais is the grape that's mission grapes, like you were talking about.
Okay.
Mission grapes being brought over and wine being made from them. Yeah, it's like an acquired taste, right? So this one actually came from, goodness, where was that? I think it was from Argentina. And we had this Pais, and the story behind it was fascinating. There were like these Pais vineyards that had gone wild on an island, and this guy would go over and bring the grapes over and was doing all this amazing, really interesting fermentation, all this. But it was a very funky wine. And we tried to sell it at the wine shop, and people tried it, and they're just like,
thank you, but no, too funky.
Too funky. So we're in the position of finding a balance. We don't go that funky, right? Or find those weird wines. We want wines that are going to be enjoyable, that are going to be accessible, that aren't going to be like, oh, you're with a bunch of snooty PhDs who are like, oh my God, this is fantastic. It's really about like, hey, here's this unbelievably beautiful wine, which is coming out of Croatia that you might not have access to otherwise. So we work with distributors to identify those. We do a lot of tasting.
Yeah.
We have a lot of friends, and Bay Area is fantastic for doing that.
Yes. Yeah.
And a lot of times they have these things on their books that they love, but they're unable to sell elsewhere. And so we try to daylight that. And so it's a really kind of virtuous cycle in that way.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, so how do you find it? But there you go.
Yeah. We just kind of are doing our exploration is sometimes abroad. Like we'll go to Georgia, we'll go to Greece, Spain. And we definitely have taken those research trips to try to rustle stuff up. But mostly we're working with importers and just, that's our approach. When
and where's the next trip?
That's a good question. So we just finished our trip. I unfortunately didn't get a chance to go. I was part of the research trip that set it out. We had a trip in Greece this last summer, which was like a dream because I used to teach Greek mythology and Greek religion. And we went to all the pan-Hellenic sites. So you think about the Olympics. That's one of 4 different sites that ancient Greeks would go to and have athletic games and different competitions. The others were at Isthmia, Delphi, like Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, and Nemea. So we created a tour that was visiting all of those sites. And it just so happens that Nemea particularly is like one of the premier wine producing regions in Greece. And the things that are happening in Greece now are so innovative and so amazing. So we'd go visit an ancient, site during the day, and then we'd go, and see a winery in the afternoon. So we're trying to do more of that. We have trips planned. We're going to do Georgia at some point. John, we still want to reach out to you about this if you're listening.
And you should be.
We'll send him a link. Don't worry.
Send him a link.
Yeah. So Georgia's on our books. We'd love to do a Sicilian, Sicily and Crete, possibly putting those two together as a tour. And it's a labor of love. I mean, none of us are taking a salary or really. It's funny because we do some nonprofit work, and
I was just going to get into Share.
Oh yeah. So this started as a fundraiser for Share, which is a nonprofit that does archaeological projects in Israel and Palestine, using archaeology as a bridge to bring people together to talk about the past, but getting people
commonalities in current.
Exactly. So that fundraiser then ended up branching out into the work that we're doing now and the travel and the teaching that we're doing. So it's been quite a journey. We oftentimes say, we're running a nonprofit and then it's a startup, right? It's And it's a labor of love and something we truly love doing, because we get to travel, we get to teach, we get to do the work we like doing. And we're hoping to expand that and continue it and just share it with as many people as we can.
Share.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you envision it going forward? Because unfortunately, it's not so happy right now in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a really difficult time. It's a really difficult time to be doing this kind of work,
and especially nonprofit.
Yeah, we primarily have worked with the institutions we worked with are on pause. Most excavations are on pause during this kind of current hostility that's taking place. I think it underscores the need for dialogue. And one thing that we often stress is we're not talking about agreement. We're talking about understanding, right? And that's a very different thing. It's about creating mutual understanding and providing opportunities for discussions. And just like wine, archaeology is also politics, right? It's history is politics. We like to joke that the one thing that we do when we bring all our students who are coming from, Israeli, Palestinian institutions, the one thing that they can agree on is that they hate waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and having, these old dudes tell them what to do. And they dig over there and do this and that. The power of collective suffering, right?
Yes,
it works.
Brings you together.
It does. Yeah.
Our common enemy.
Yeah.
We're friends. Common enemy.
It actually, believe it or not, it works.
Yeah. Totally misquoted Sun Tzu, but you know what I mean.
No, totally.
Yeah. Okay, and this, tell me, I'm fascinated by archaeology. I feel like a part of me growing up missed their calling. And oddly, my husband is like the same way. So what are opportunities for going on digs?
Oh, that's a really great question. Yeah, there are
totally off the wine subject. You can.
We were talking about, looking at opportunities in places like we were talking about Arini 1. So that is an excavation. I believe it's wrapped up now. It was run by University of California, Los Angeles, like UCLA. There are, a funny story, segue. It used to be that you would be paid to go on an archaeological dig way back in the day before like W.F. Albright, who then was like, you know what? In like the 1900s, we could probably get people to come and do this for free because it's lots of fun. Yeah. And now people pay to go. Right?
I bet, yeah.
So there are field schools, plenty. IFR, I can plug. The Institute for Field Research is a great accredited program for budding archaeologists, and you can find field programs that are all throughout the world, really. So there are opportunities out there. We'll definitely get you digging.
Still dreaming. I'm going to keep in touch. We're going to keep in touch.
For sure.
All right, weaving it back into wine then. Yeah. What advice do you have for people that are just beginning to explore their wine journey and they're like, man, there's so much stuff out there. What would you say to them? That's
a really good question. I would say keep an open mind and an open palate.
Yeah.
I think that the times that I have been most surprised and most delighted by wine have been the moments where I really was I was in a space or a place or a setting where I was open. Mm-hmm. I wasn't locked down. I didn't have my kind of preconceived notions put in place, and that's so important to try new things, to try to expand your horizons. Back to our classical connections, right? This is what the Greeks knew. This is what the Egyptians knew. It's something that binds us and brings us together and fills all of these different parts of society, like we've talked about.
What brought us together?
Exactly, right? So how cool is that? Yeah. It's so that I think would be the one thing I would say is, and also just don't get overwhelmed with trying to I need to learn the master court, session series of how to properly blind taste, or I'm going to get really deep and entrenched in this one space. It's perfectly fine to like what you like, to know what you like, or not know what you like. Just so I think I like many wine people. Like when I started at our shop, I had very strong opinions about French wine, very strong opinions about bushel and California wines, particularly Zinfandel, where it was coming from. And I found that as I've progressed in my journey, especially as I've expanded into these different realms, and we've got to push the boundaries even a little bit with them, that broader sense of just relaxing and enjoying and coming back to really what it's about drives home. So that's what I would say, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Dana, I appreciate this so.
Oh, are you kidding me? So much fun.
Fascinating.
No, it's great.
When I told everyone, I'm like, my next interview is going to be about ancient history of wine. That's so cool. So this is like, check this like off the box. So
Anytime. Give me, it's always such a pleasure.
I appreciate the wine. Dana brought the wine. I offered to pay for it. He said, what's wine between two friends?
This is right. Yeah,
exactly. It's a bottle between two friends. So cheers, my friends.
Cheers. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. This is Norma and Dana on Just the Sip. Join us next month for our next episode.
Cheers, everybody.